I had the hardest time not playing the air guitar during that video. Hey everyone, I'm so glad that you're here, so glad that we could be together. I am sincerely glad that you made it with us today. Before I bring today's message, I want to invite you on a mission trip with me. Next June, I'm headed back to Kenya for the first time in several years. My prayer is that 99 of you will go with me, that we'll take 100 people to visit and to serve our friends at Mohi in Kenya in the Nairobi area primarily. If you have any interest in that, there is an introductory meeting that I would like for you to find a way to attend next Sunday. Coming to the meeting doesn't obligate you to go, obviously, but the meeting is important for those who eventually choose to be a part of the trip. So here's what I'd like for you to do right now. Normally, I'm not encouraged to see you with your phone out on Facebook during the sermons, but I would love for you to take your phone out right now, text the word Kenya to 217-217. 217-217, text the word Kenya, and we'll reply to that link, provide you all the information you need to know what's up with next week's meeting. If you want to go but you cannot make the meeting, do the same thing. Text the word Kenya to 217-217. We want to get your name on the list, even if next week cannot work for you. Well, I went to the doctor recently for an annual checkup where I was asked a series of questions about my health. And most of the questions were designed to gauge my physical health, but a few of the questions were aimed at my emotional state, my mental health. Now, we all get those questions at the doctor's office, right? Right? Wait a minute. They were just asking me those questions? Now, fortunately, the stigma that makes us unwilling to discuss mental health is fading, and that's a good thing for us. A few days ago in the Wall Street Journal, there was a report that a task force is recommending that every adult be screened for anxiety. The article revealed that more than 30% of adults reported symptoms of anxiety over the last few months, and 22% of adults received treatment for it. Friend, I could overwhelm you with additional studies that prove that we are overwhelmed. And every demographic is being impacted. Kids, teenagers, college students, moms, dads, retirees. We are battling anxiety. So like David, it is time for us to pray, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts." One thing the pandemic exposed is that church leaders suffer from anxiety too. Books and podcasts for worried pastors exploded in number and visibility since 2020. Over the last 2 years, an unusually high percentage of ordained ministers have retired or found another line of work or announced that they will retire soon. And some attribute this exodus to the high levels of anxiety. A pastor friend sent me this meme of a 35-year-old pastor who has a great smile, but who may not realize the toll that ministry is taking on his youthful looks. You know, one of the things that helps me right-size my anxiety is being familiar with history. When we start to believe that the trials and the pressure that we face are somehow worse than what other people have experienced, it is helpful to dig into the biographies of the people who came before us. When I was in college, I wrote a paper on the famous English preacher Charles Spurgeon. Spurgeon famously said, "I have learned to kiss the wave that throws me against the rock of ages." Those are brilliant words. And it is no small detail that Spurgeon said he learned this viewpoint, because it usually is not instinctive for us. If you're like me, Spurgeon's language calls up memories of standing on a rocky coastline as waves crash ashore. It sounds like thunder. It feels like a gentle earthquake. But to be caught between those waves and those rocks, that is where people are injured and are killed. That is where watercraft can be battered to pieces. So it's no wonder that most of us have the impulse to curse those waves, to curse those trials, those problems, the illnesses, the unexpected repair bills, the dysfunctional people who downgrade our lives in some way. Even if we manage to restrain the curses, there are certainly no kisses for the waves of trouble that come our way. If you've been injured by hard times, if you've been injured by broken people, you may be tempted to mock or even resent a sentiment like Spurgeon expressed. I mean, kiss the waves? Sure, he was waxing philosophical, but what would the pastor of London's largest church know about suffering? I mean, it sounds like a pretty cushy assignment in God's kingdom. Well, Spurgeon was a preacher in the mid-1800s, and his church was huge. He preached to overflow crowds constantly. And since there was no radio, no TV, no internet, his sermons were never broadcast, but they were shared in print more than 50 million times during his life. He was easily the most famous preacher in the world, and seminary students still study his brilliant sermons. But in spite of his influence, Spurgeon was weighed down by heavy personal problems. First, he led a large church before there was a catalog of knowledge on how to lead a large church. So he worked far too much, preparing and preaching more than a dozen times many weeks. Spurgeon struggled with depression, which I mentioned earlier this year in a message. But I did not tell you that his despair was driven by the illness of his wife, who was bedridden for 25 years. And he also endured acute pain of his own. Spurgeon preached against slavery in 1850, which brought criticism and opposition from powerful people. And he also bore the stress of leading his church out of a denomination that was hedging on its commitment to the authority of Scripture. So when Charles Spurgeon spoke of waves of trouble, he was not some dry land sailor, unfamiliar with real waves and real storms. Spurgeon died at 57 from poor health brought on by stress and anxiety. If not for his faith, he would have died even younger. So today I want to explore a famous passage in which Jesus makes a point of being with his disciples during a ferocious storm. Anyone who has ever read this passage realizes that its purpose is not to give a lesson in meteorology and boating safety. Before we read it, I'll just tell you the purpose of this passage is to assure us that Jesus will be with us when life is difficult, and to assure us that he has the power to help us. So when storms come, you and I must choose to either curse the waves or to kiss the waves. And I want us to think about which we want to do from this point forward in our lives. We have to choose to be anxious or to trust in the master of the storm. Look at Matthew 8, verse 23. Jesus got into the boat and started across the lake with his disciples. Suddenly, a fierce storm struck the lake with waves breaking into the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him up, shouting, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." Now, the Sea of Galilee is a familiar location to you if you're a Bible reader, if you've been in church for a while. But the name Sea of Galilee can mislead you if you're unfamiliar with it, because it's not an ocean-like sea. The Sea of Galilee is really a large lake. It's 13 miles from north to south. It's about 7 miles wide. So it's 65 square miles of surface. Lake of the Ozarks in Missouri, where most of us have been at some point, is roughly 84 square miles, a little larger than the Sea of Galilee. So maybe we should start calling it Sea of the Ozarks. It's got a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Property values would go up if we called it that. Jesus had been teaching, conversing, working with people all day. He was exhausted. So he lay down in the boat as the disciples piloted the boat across the lake. Now, they were fishermen, so they could handle anything that would come up as they were moving across the lake, right? Well, not this time. A violent, terrifying storm formed quickly as they were making the crossing. I've canceled a couple of trips to the Holy Land over the last couple of years because of all the crazy things in the world. But those who have been to this region tell me that the Bible's description of a sudden storm that comes up on the Sea of Galilee is absolutely consistent with the weather patterns in this area. The Sea of Galilee is actually 700 feet below sea level, and the contours of the surrounding mountains and rivers create the perfect opportunity for strong winds and storms. So it is common for violent storms to form on the Sea of Galilee. And when they do, the waves can reach 15 to 20 feet above the surface of the water. So when the Bible tells us that waves were crashing inside the boat as Jesus and his friends made their way across the lake, it is exactly what one would expect during a storm on the Sea of Galilee. But did you notice how unnerved the disciples were by this storm? I mean, that detail tells us a lot about the nature of this storm. My wife's brother is an avid sportsman. He is a real fishing and boating guy. He knows the waters of eastern North Carolina like the back of his hand. So if I was on the water with David, my wife's brother, when a storm emerged and David said to me, Eddie, everything's fine, then I would be chill. At least on the outside, I would be chill. Because I trust David's skill, I trust his judgment, I know his experience. But if David, the fisherman and experienced boat pilot, looked at me and said, this is not good, Eddie, we're in trouble, then I would worry and I would begin praying. So do you recall what some of the disciples, the followers of Jesus, did for a living before they began following Jesus? The Bible says they left their nets and followed him. Those were not basketball hoop nets. They were fishing nets. These guys had fished the Sea of Galilee for a living. They had fished there as little boys and worked with their fathers, and they had made their living fishing there. They would not be rattled by a mild storm. They would not even be rattled by a bad storm. They would know if everything was going to be fine or if they should be concerned. And what do these men do? Well, Jesus was asleep and they woke him up with their shouting. They were now like, hey, Jesus, things are getting bad out here. No, they were screaming, begging him to do something. Now, we're in Matthew's version of this event. In Mark's version, he says the disciples woke Jesus up by shouting, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Water is pouring into the boat faster than they can bail it. They are petrified and they are oddly angry with Jesus. And so they didn't say, Master, don't you care? I did practice that. And that's just weird. No, Matthew reveals that they were screaming, don't you care about us? Has anyone ever looked at you when they were upset with you, that you didn't seem to be showing enough concern about something, and asked you, don't you care? Do you know the intensity with which someone says that? Just for the record, the disciples are not kissing the wave at this point. They're cursing the wave. They are not in the place Jesus wants them to be. But Jesus does not say, hey, don't use that tone of voice with me. Don't you know who I am? They're about to find out who he is. He understands their fear. He doesn't validate their fear, but he understands it. He knows how they got to the place where they were. But he expects something better from them. And I think all of us need to understand that when we don't lead with our faith and our trust in Jesus, he expects something better from us. He is ready to see more trust sooner regarding more things from us. Friend, Jesus deserves to be trusted. He deserves to be trusted. He's earned that trust. And when we don't trust him, it disappoints him. He said to his disciples in John 14, do not allow your hearts to be troubled. Trust in God, trust also in me. This is the relationship Jesus wants with us. He wants a relationship of trust. And I suspect that Jesus feels sorry for us because he knows that all the drama, all the angst that we are often feeling is unnecessary if we lead with trust. I mean, there have to be times that Jesus is like, really, Eddie? How long have you been following me? How long have you been teaching people to follow me and to trust me? How many times have I proven my faithfulness to you? Why are you not leading with trust? I think Jesus would ask me that question if we were face to face at times. So here's a question for you. How many times have you been all up in God's face over the difficult things that were happening to you? And yet, here you are. He has delivered you. You have gained some things from those challenges you would have gained from nothing else. But you were the disciples screaming, "Hey, don't you care about me, Jesus?" And Jesus is thinking, "Why do you call me Lord if you're not going to trust me to be your Lord?" Have you ever gone back to Jesus after one of those times and said, "Jesus, I'm sorry. I'm embarrassed. I want to learn from this. I want to learn to kiss the wave that throws me against the rock of ages. I want to trust you, not after everything has worked out and I look back and see that I should have trusted you. I want to trust you in the storm." By the way, can we talk about what Jesus was doing at this point in the boat? My man is asleep. I was going to say he was sleeping like a baby. He was sleeping like a teenager. And we all know that's a heavy sleep. That's how little anxiety Jesus has. His Apple Watch is not warning him that his pulse is too high. He is in a life-threatening storm and he is in a deep sleep. One version of the Bible says Jesus was taking a nap on a cushion. Have you ever rolled up a shirt, rolled up a jacket, used it as a pillow when you had to grab a nap? That is exactly what Jesus is doing here. Years ago, my wife and I were meeting with a psychologist because a church wanted to hire me, and the church was putting us through the paces. They wanted to make sure they knew us, so they sent us for this evaluation. I was a bit anxious about this evaluation. When you know someone is evaluating you, it's a little nervy. What if it didn't go well? What if I joked about something and he thought I was serious? So I was on my best behavior. I was alert. Well, we had been with the psychologist for several hours. My wife wasn't engaged in the conversation at that point, and we had had a long travel day the day before, and Sharon was feeling it. She was tired. So during our psych evaluation, Sharon curled up on a couch and went to sleep. And I'm thinking, honey, this is a job interview. It could impact our future. And Sharon's like, nighty-night. And you know what? She was right. The psychologist told me later that any spouse that takes a nap during an evaluation is probably not hiding anything. So my wife is exactly like Jesus when it comes to naps. Next time you need a nap, just say, "I'm going to go be like Jesus for an hour or so. I'll see you later." So the disciples wake Jesus up, screaming in fear, in terror. And how does Jesus respond? In Matthew 8, verse 26, Jesus replies, "Why are you afraid? You have so little faith." Then he got up and rebuked the wind and waves, and suddenly there was great calm. When you are anxious, when you are uneasy, do you ever ask yourself that question, the question Jesus asked them, that he apparently wants us to ask ourselves? Why? Why am I so afraid? Sometimes the answer is because we are addicted to control. Actually, we're not addicted to control because we really don't control things. We're addicted to the illusion of control. But we don't have to be on the Sea of Galilee to know that we can't control the weather. We live in the Midwest. We know we can't control the weather, right? And there is a lot about life that is similar to the weather. Have you noticed that life and the weather are a lot alike in terms of the unpredictability of them? We think we can control our spouses. And about day 3 of marriage, we realize that's not true. We think we can control our kids. And again, about day 3 of their lives, we realize that's not true either. We think we can control the economy. Haven't we learned we can't do that? We think we can control our health, but in many ways, we can't. And God is like, when did I ever say that you were supposed to control things? I think what he's wanting us to realize is that we can't and we don't. We need to put our trust in someone who can. So friend, you need to start asking yourself more often, every time anxiety is settling on you, why am I afraid? Why? And if you answer honestly, I promise you will grow spiritually. By the way, did you notice the honesty and the mercy of Jesus in the verse that we read? He was honest with his disciples. He answered his own question. Jesus asked, why are you afraid? And then he answered his question, because you have so little faith. And then the rebuke comes, and I love this. He doesn't rebuke them. He rebukes the wind and the waves. Matthew doesn't quote what Jesus says, but Mark does in his account. He rebuked the wind and said to the waves, silence, be still. That word actually means be muzzled. I mean, Jesus used a very powerful, controlling term. Friend, why would we doubt someone who can do that? I think what Jesus wanted his friends to be asking one another after this moment is, why would we ever doubt this man? Why would we doubt him? Why would we not trust him? And you and I should ask the same thing. So let me offer 2 takeaways from this story. The first is an obvious but very important one. Riding with Jesus does not eliminate life storms. If anyone has ever given you that impression, if anyone has ever told you, if you will just believe in Jesus, if you will just trust in God, then he will make your way smooth. Well, the Bible does say he will make your path straight. It doesn't mean he will give you a life with no problems. Jesus did not protect his closest followers from storms and waves. He taught them that his presence would sustain them in the storm. Look, here's the thing. This was the worst storm that these fishermen who fished the Sea of Galilee had ever experienced on the Sea of Galilee. It was the worst storm. It was the one that they would say to their friends, it was the worst storm I've ever seen. And who is with them? Jesus is with them. So his presence and their following him did not prevent that terrible storm. There is a verse that we go back to a couple of times each year at this church because it is a truth that we need to keep in mind. And in John 16:33, Jesus said this so clearly. He said, I have told you all of this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth, you will have, say the next phrase with me, many trials and sorrows. And then he goes on to say, but take heart because I've overcome the world. He didn't say, because you're with me, you will have very few trials, very few sorrows. He said, there will be many. And he didn't say this to heighten your anxiety because he introduced that statement by saying, look, I want you to have peace. Well, how do you have peace when someone says you're going to have a lot of problems? You have peace if that person is someone you can trust in your problems. He said it to prepare you and to fill you with peace, even as the problems and the storms are raging. Why? Because when you know what's coming, you can prepare for it. Here it is, straight from the lips of Jesus. I will have many trials and sorrows. Not a few, many, a lot. Storms are coming, and waves will be crashing into our boats at times. So we need to stay with Jesus and keep him close so that we can know that we can remain poised even when the problems are in our faces. I was on a flight earlier this year that experienced the worst turbulence that I've ever experienced on an airplane. The captain spoke to us from the cockpit, and I'm so glad he did not say, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what to tell you because they did not prepare us for this in flight school. We used a simulator that had all blue skies, so I have no idea what to do with this weather. You know he didn't say that. Actually, he had told us earlier in the flight that turbulence was expected, so when it came, we were all more calm than we might have otherwise been. When it began, he said, hey folks, sorry you're getting bounced around back there, but we expect to escape the unstable air over the next few minutes. Everything's fine. There's smooth air ahead. By the way, what would you say if you heard a travel agency that was telling potential travelers that they would never experience turbulence when they flew? Well, if you're an experienced traveler, that would frustrate you because you know that simply is not true. And what Jesus is doing for you and me is making sure that we don't have unrealistic expectations. When Peter wrote a letter to the early churches that were scattered around the known world at that time, he wanted them to have realistic expectations because Christians were always talking. So what do you think about problems, trouble? What should we expect? So Peter writes a letter and he says, dear friends. So these are people he loves that he's about to say this to. Dear friends, don't be surprised at the painful trial you are going through, the fiery trials you are going through, as if something strange were happening to you. Listen, friend, the TV and the YouTube preachers will not preach from verses like this because they will tell you you can avoid the difficulty. You can avoid the challenges. If you're really tight with Jesus, then you'll be able to avoid those things. That is not what Jesus taught. And that is not what his closest followers experienced. And it is not what they taught after Jesus went back to heaven. So do not be surprised when trials come. Don't assume that you will be the exception rather than the rule. So here's the second takeaway. What Jesus desires most from you and from me is our trust. That's what he made clear to his disciples on the boat that day. He was worthy of their trust, and he wanted their trust. He calmed the storm instantly to prove to them that they could always trust him no matter what was going on, no matter how long the storms may last. Have you ever been near the water or on the water right after a fierce storm or a line of storms blew through? I mean, the sky may clear, the wind may calm, but what about the water? Well, the water is still choppy, but not on this day, not with Jesus. Jesus calms the wind and the water, and some might sarcastically say, well, maybe the storm just blew over. But he stilled the water. Peace, be still. And it was still. The noise was gone. It was water skiing smooth in an instant. Ever been out right at sunrise to water ski when the water is like glass? That's what happened on the Sea of Galilee in that moment. The waves were replaced by an eerie calm. You know, I love the final line in the record of this event. Matthew 8:27 says, the disciples were amazed. I guess the disciples were amazed. Who is this man? They asked, as if he hadn't just proven who he was. Even the wind and the waves obey him. There was such fear and terror associated with the water, with the sea, and with storms. They didn't have the radars. They didn't have the ability to predict the weather. They couldn't do what we do in terms of awareness. There was so much fear. So the disciples, they see what Jesus does. Even the wind and the waves obey him. And if the wind and the waves obey him, why are you afraid? Why am I afraid? He is God in the flesh. That's who he is. He can be trusted. I don't recall ever mentioning it in a teaching, but more than 30 years ago, my sister and brother-in-law lost a child. They named him Joshua, but when his little body was born, his spirit was already with the Lord. I was not married at the time, so I was the annoying single brother who would drop in on short notice to visit my sister and her husband and eat the good food they had in the refrigerator. And I would talk to my sister on the phone, and I would tease her and say, hey, where's this nephew I'm supposed to get? We need this nephew. Can you get busy on this? And we would laugh. I would call and ask how she was doing. She would call me with updates. She called me one day and choked up as she told me the baby did not survive. And I could hear the heaviness of the grief in her voice. It was an incredibly sad time for her and her husband, especially for all of us. Some of you know that sadness. It's difficult for you to hear me tell that story without reliving that grief. But what I remember most is my sister and her husband saying that day, and in the days that followed that terrible day, they said, we can't pretend our hearts aren't broken, but we trust God in this. It was the worst storm they had been through in their lives up to that moment. But they were expressing their trust in God. They didn't know what it meant. They didn't know what the future would be like. They didn't know if they would have a child, but they were choosing to trust God. And they said, we trust that Joshua is with the Lord and that we'll see him again. We trust that God has a good plan for our lives. We know that God loves us even though this is a painful loss. And we trust that we'll all be reunited someday. And on the day that everyone would have understood if their faith was shaken and if they had cursed the waves that were throwing them against the Rock of Ages, they chose to kiss the waves. I know some of you are navigating stormy seas right now. It's not a metaphor for you. I just heard, just before this service started, someone else who's facing aggressive cancer. Cancer is a stormy sea. Recurring cancer is a very stormy sea. And it is an unforgiving wave that will push you against the Rock of Ages. Will you curse it or will you kiss it? A lost child is a stormy sea. Financial problems out of which you can't see an escape. That's such a stormy sea. A tough marriage is a stormy sea. But when you remember who the man in the boat with you is, it changes everything. Who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey him? And I promise you, every other force, every other evil, every other problem, every other trial will also yield to his voice someday. He will say, peace, be still, and it will be over. So will you trust him with your whole life? Not just as you look back and see that he got you through it. Will you trust him during your storm?